It is the 10th of July 1943, and the ground beneath the feet of a British infantry section is still warm from the Sicilian sun. The men of the Green Howards have pushed inland from the beaches of Operation Husky, and now, somewhere in the shadow of an olive grove, the low grinding of steel treads rises above the cicadas. A tiger. Or perhaps a Panzer IV. In the half-light, it hardly matters. What matters is the weapon one man is now hauling into position, a crude, heavy, deeply ungainly contraption that looks, to most soldiers who encounter it for the first time, less like a cutting-edge anti-tank weapon and more like a particularly aggressive piece of plumbing. He braces himself. He presses the steel stock against his shoulder. He knows, as every man who carries this thing knows, that firing it will feel like being kicked by a horse. He squeezes. There is a sound that some survivors later describe, not as an explosion, but as a sharp, violent compression, a thud that originates from the weapon itself and travels directly into the bones of the shoulder and chest. The bomb arcs away through the darkness in a lazy, almost casual trajectory. Then the armor lights up. The weapon is the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, the PIAT, and the story of how it came to exist, why soldiers hated it so thoroughly, and why it quietly outperformed every comparable weapon the Allies possessed, is one of the most remarkable and least celebrated chapters of the Second World War. By 1940, the British Army was in a state of profound crisis. The fall of France had not merely been a military defeat, it had been a public demonstration, in the most catastrophic possible terms, of what armor could do to infantry. German panzers had not simply beaten Allied tanks in pitched battle, they had simply driven through men on foot as though those men were inconveniences rather than obstacles. The age of the tank, it turned out, had arrived, and Britain had almost nothing with which to stop one. The weapons that existed were, charitably speaking, inadequate. The boy's anti-tank rifle, a bolt-action weapon that fired a 13.9mm round, had been designed in the late 1930s with optimism that its penetration capability would keep pace with tank armor. It did not. By 1940, the boys was already struggling to defeat the frontal armor of medium tanks, and it was notoriously punishing to fire, generating a recoil so savage that soldiers joked it was more likely to injure the firer than the enemy. The 2-pounder anti-tank gun was more effective, but it was a crew-served artillery piece. It could not be carried by a single infantryman into a ditch or a hedgerow or the upper floor of a farmhouse. What was needed was something a single soldier could carry, deploy rapidly, and use against a tank at close range. Something that could be brought to bear in the chaos of street fighting, in the narrow lanes of Normandy bocage, in the rubble of an Italian hill town. Something portable, reliable, and capable of defeating armor measured in centimeters rather than millimeters. The British Army put out the requirement. The Ministry of Supply went looking for solutions. What they found, or rather what they built, was extraordinary in its unconventionality. A weapon that dispensed almost entirely with the established logic of anti-tank projectiles and relied on a principle so counterintuitive that many engineers initially dismissed it outright. The man most responsible for the PIAT's existence was Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, an officer with a background not in conventional ordnance, but in the darker, more improvisational corners of British weapons development. Blacker had already designed the Blacker Bombard, a spigot mortar that had been issued to the Home Guard in vast numbers following Dunkirk, and it was from this device that the PIAT's central mechanism derived. The weapon was developed and refined at the Directorate of Artillery and later at the Ministry of Supply's facilities at Fort Halstead in Kent, where a small team of engineers worked through 1941 and into 1942 to transform the basic concept into a manufacturable weapon. The PIAT worked on the spigot mortar principle, which distinguished it fundamentally from the American Bazooka and the German Panzerschreck, both of which were rocket launchers. The bazooka fired its projectile using a rocket motor contained within the bomb itself. This meant the weapon produced a backblast when fired, a jet of hot propellant gas that erupted from the rear of the tube and made firing from enclosed spaces extremely dangerous. A soldier firing a bazooka inside a building risked setting the room alight or incapacitating himself with the blast. The PIAT had no such problem. It had no rocket. Instead, it used a powerful coiled spring, a mainspring of exceptional tension, weighing roughly 1.8 kilograms and compressed into the body of the weapon, to drive a hollow steel rod, the spigot, forward when the trigger was released. The spigot struck a propellant cartridge contained in the tail of the bomb, detonating it and propelling the projectile forward. The recoil of the explosion then drove the spigot back, compressing the main spring again and theoretically cocking the weapon for the next shot. Though, in practice, this self-cocking mechanism was unreliable, and soldiers, in combat, frequently found themselves having to manually recock the weapon by pressing the stock against the ground and hauling the body upward with considerable force. This required a man of reasonable strength and considerable determination. The bomb itself was where the real ingenuity resided. The PIAT fired a shaped charge round, a projectile that used the Monroe effect to concentrate its explosive energy into a narrow jet of superplastic metal traveling at enormous velocity. On contact with armor, this jet could penetrate approximately 75 to 100 millimeters of hardened steel, enough to defeat the side and rear armor of virtually any German tank in service in 1943, and sufficient, under the right conditions, to threaten even the front armor of lighter vehicles. The bomb weighed approximately 1.1 kilograms and was stabilized in flight by a simple tail fin arrangement. The weapon's overall weight was around 15.9 kilograms, heavy, awkward, and deeply unpopular with the men who had to carry it. The PIAT was manufactured primarily by ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries, at its facilities in Britain, with additional production contracted to other firms as demand increased. By the end of the war, somewhere in the region of 115,000 PIATs had been produced, though, as with many wartime production figures, the precise number remains difficult to verify with absolute certainty. The PIAT's combat debut in Sicily in July 1943 was followed by extensive use throughout the Italian campaign, where the weapon found its natural environment in the close quarters, fighting of hill towns and monastery assaults. It was in Italy that the PIAT first demonstrated something that its creators had hoped for, but perhaps not fully anticipated. That in the confined spaces where infantry and armor intersected most violently, the ability to fire from indoors or from beneath cover without producing a backblast was not merely a technical advantage, but a life-saving one. Sergeant Major accounts from the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, fighting north through Ortona in December 1943, describe PIAT teams working methodically through the rubble, using the weapon to engage enemy armor and machine gun positions at distances sometimes as short as 15 meters. At such ranges, the flat trajectory mattered less than the ability to be invisible until the moment of firing. German tank commanders, who had developed effective procedures for dealing with bazooka teams based partly on the visible flash and smoke of the rocket motor, found PIAT ambushes considerably harder to predict. In Normandy in 1944, the weapon accumulated perhaps its most celebrated single engagement. On the night of 12th to 13th August 1944, Major Robert Kane of the South Staffordshire Regiment, already wounded and partially blinded, used a PIAT to engage German tanks at close range during the Battle of Arnhem, an action for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross. The PIAT's ability to be used by a single determined soldier in the ruins of a Dutch town, without specialist training beyond the basics, without crew support, without a prepared position, was central to that extraordinary action. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The American Bazooka, which entered service in 1942, was in many respects a more elegant weapon than the PIAT. It was lighter, roughly 5.98 kilograms for the M1A1 version, and considerably easier to fire, producing no significant recoil and requiring minimal physical strength. Its rocket-propelled projectile could reach its target more quickly and with a flatter trajectory. In purely abstract terms, it appeared to be the superior weapon. And yet, the combat record told a more complicated story. The bazooka's backblast limited its use in buildings and confined positions. Its rocket motor left a visible smoke trail that could reveal the firer's position. In the damp conditions of northwestern Europe, the electrical ignition system was occasionally unreliable. And perhaps most critically, its penetration figures, around 90 to 120 millimeters for the later M9A1 version, while adequate against most German vehicles, left little margin against the frontal armor of heavy tanks when conditions were not ideal. The German Panzerschreck, essentially a direct copy of the bazooka, developed after German engineers examined captured examples in North Africa, was larger and heavier than its American counterpart, with superior penetration figures of around 150 millimeters. It was an effective weapon, unambiguously more powerful than either the bazooka or the PIAT in penetration terms, but it produced an even more pronounced backblast, required the operator to wear a protective cape and face shield, and was never manufactured in sufficient numbers to equip infantry formations comprehensively. The statistics that most directly illustrate the PIAT's effectiveness are not technical specifications but casualty figures. Allied after-action reports from the Normandy campaign and the subsequent advance through France and the Low Countries consistently credited the PIAT with more armor kills than the bazooka, despite the two weapons being issued to formations in roughly comparable numbers. The figures vary by source and are complicated by attribution difficulties. A burning tank might have been hit by the PIAT, then the crew dispatched by small arms fire, but the aggregate picture is clear enough. A weapon that soldiers complained about bitterly, that caused injury through its own recoil, that required enormous effort to recock, that was heavy and ungainly and generally wretched to carry. This weapon, in the hands of ordinary infantry, was killing more German tanks than the American alternative that everyone preferred to use. The PIAT's legacy is complicated, as the legacies of genuinely innovative weapons tend to be. It was not the most powerful anti-tank weapon of the war. It was not the most accurate. It was not, by any reasonable measure, the most pleasant to use. Soldiers' memoirs are full of descriptions of the weapon that range from grudging respect to outright contempt, and the physical toll of operating it, particularly the mandatory manual recocking procedure, was sufficiently significant that units occasionally designated their largest, most physically imposing men as PIAT operators by default rather than by aptitude. And yet, the principle it embodied, the shaped charge warhead, delivered without rocket backblast, using a mechanism that required no external propellant charge, pointed forward rather than backward. The recoilless rifle designs that emerged in the late 1940s owed something to the lessons learned from all wartime anti-tank weapons, including the PIAT. The Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle, which remains in service with the British Army to this day in updated form, reflects a lineage of thinking about infantry anti-tank capability that the PIAT helped to define. A small number of PIATs survive in museums and private collections. The Imperial War Museum in London holds examples, as does the Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset, where visitors can examine the weapon and, if they are particularly imaginative, attempt to understand how a man under fire in a Sicilian olive grove or a Dutch canal town might have worked up the nerve to use it. Return, then, to that grove in Sicily in July 1943. Return to the soldier pressing the steel stock to his shoulder, knowing what is about to happen to him, knowing the violence the weapon will visit upon his own body before it visits any upon the enemy. He fires, the spring releases, the spigot strikes, the bomb goes, the tank burns. In the years between 1943 and 1945, British and Commonwealth infantry used the PIAT in Sicily and Italy, in Normandy, and the Bocage at Arnhem and across the Rhine, through the wreckage of Germany and into the spring of 1945. They used it in Burma. They used it in North Africa. They used it in conditions of mud and cold and dark and heat and rubble, in situations where doctrine had no guidance and improvisation was the only strategy. They used it in places where no other weapon would serve, in rooms, in cellars, beneath vehicles, in positions so close to the enemy that the idea of rocket backblast was not merely inconvenient but fatal. Sergeant Thomas Derrick of the Australian Army fired his PIAT from a range of approximately 15 metres during the Battle for Saddleburg in New Guinea in November 1943. Sergeant Major Harold Marshall used his at Casino. Major Kane used his at Arnhem until the mechanism failed, then picked up another. In each case, the weapon performed, not cleanly, not gracefully, not without cost to the man behind it, but it performed. The PIAT destroyed more tanks than the bazooka, not because it was a better weapon by any conventional measure. It destroyed more tanks because of where it could go that the bazooka could not, into buildings, into cellars, into the cramped upper floors of Dutch houses with enemy armor grinding through the streets below. It destroyed more tanks because it could be fired without the betraying flash and smoke that made bazooka teams vulnerable. It destroyed more tanks, in the end, because the men who used it had no choice but to master a weapon they despised, and because that mastery, earned through necessity and pain and grim determination, turned an awkward, brutal, deeply unloved piece of British engineering into one of the most effective infantry weapons of the entire war. Soldiers hated the PIAT. The PIAT did not care. It simply worked.